Bonjour, hello. Je m'adresse à vous de mon bureau à Ottawa sur le territoire ancestral des Kanien'kehá:ka, la nation Mohawk. Il est particulièrement approprié de souligner que Montréal est aussi un lieu de rencontre historique pour plusieurs Premières Nations. We've just wrapped up 2 days of productive meetings with justice and public safety ministers from across Canada. It was a pleasure to gather in person for the first time since the beginning of the pandemic and to see for ourselves that Nova Scotia is well on the road to recovery after the devastating impact of Hurricane Fiona. I want to thank Minister Brad Johns for co-chairing this meeting and for being such a graceful host. Au cours des 2 dernières journées de discussion, j'ai trouvé encourageant de constater à quel point la collaboration sont forte entre les ministres des gouvernements fédéraux, provinciaux et territoriaux. Nous avons également pu tirer profit de la mobilisation des représentants de l'Assemblée des Premières Nations, de l'Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami et du Ralliement national des Métis. Ces discussions ont permis de réaffirmer de nombreuses priorités communes en appui des efforts de réconciliation continue. Collaboration has been a crucial element on our work to advance reconciliation and transform how Indigenous people interact with the justice system. During our meeting, I gave an update on federal implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act and on the development of an Indigenous justice strategy. The provinces and territories are key partners as we undertake the important work of addressing systemic discrimination and eliminating the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in the justice system. We remain fully committed to working with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis partners to build on progress to date and create a better, safer future for all Indigenous peoples. Another top agenda item was the lasting impact of the pandemic on our courts. We are seeing regular court operations resume, but these 2.5 years have left the courts with lingering backlogs and delays. Ministers agreed that Federal Bill S4 should be passed as soon as possible and that discussions should continue about other potential amendments related to court efficiencies. They also shared some best practices and promising strategies to address concerns about court operations. Several ministers shared their support for greater access to specialized courts, such as mental health and drug treatment courts. These courts can more effectively address the needs of accused persons with addiction or mental health issues. I look forward to working with my provincial and territorial counterparts on this important work. I was pleased to update my colleagues on our plans to establish an independent criminal cases review commission. Once set up, the commission will make it easier and faster for people to seek a review of potentially wrongful convictions. We also agreed to collaborate on the development and future implementation of Canada's Black Justice Strategy. I have been consulting with Black leaders in their community and organizations, stakeholders, and experts across the country, and will continue to learn from them and follow their lead as we advance this important initiative. Some jurisdictions have already begun this work, and I look forward to seeing further progress on provincial, territorial, and federal efforts. Another priority around the table is to enhance and modernize the family justice system. A number of ministers confirmed their support for unified family courts, which enhance access to justice and improve outcomes for Canadian families. These courts allow families to resolve legal issues in one single court system rather than 2, with a judge who specializes in family law. My counterparts and I also discussed approaches to transform and strengthen the criminal justice system. There was a good conversation on how we need to collaborate across jurisdictions to develop better ways to tackle the disturbing growth of hate crime in Canada. We also talked about preserving confidence in the administration of justice, tackling the root causes of violent reoffending, while working to address the unacceptable over-incarceration of Indigenous peoples, Black, and other racialized Canadians. These issues will require ongoing cooperation and collaboration among federal, provincial, and territorial partners. So I would like to thank my provincial and territorial counterparts for contributing to a productive dialogue over the last 2 days. Our discussions confirm that federal, provincial, and territorial governments share many priorities in the areas of justice and public safety. We are also grateful for the contributions and leadership of the Assembly of First Nations, Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami, and the Métis National Council. Together, we'll continue to make real progress on the issues that directly affect millions of Canadians across Canada. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you, Minister Lametti. And without delay, we pass to Minister Marco Mendicino, Minister of Public Safety.
Merci beaucoup, David. Bon après-midi, tout le monde. And as we begin, I too would like to acknowledge that my colleagues and I are joining you from the traditional Mi'kmaq territory. And I also want to say a special thank you to my friend and colleague, Brad, for hosting us here in Halifax. I know that this has been an extraordinarily difficult time for not only Nova Scotians, but Atlantic Canadians, residents in Eastern Quebec. And having had the chance to meet with first responders, I can see that the work is well underway. And of course, the federal government will continue to be there to do whatever we can to support you through this difficult time. And although those watching can't see, we're actually joined by a great number of other provincial and territorial colleagues. Indeed, it has been very good to reconnect in person after having to take a hiatus as a result of the pandemic. And I was saying to them before this press conference that I wish that Canadians could see the quality of discussions that we've been having on a wide range of issues, as Minister Lametti just highlighted, that touch on both justice, public safety, and reconciliation. Truly the degree of, I think, commitment to work through these issues, regardless of political stripe, was there. And I would say at the outset, it is truly a privilege to be a part of those conversations in the interests of which we are all joined, which is to keep Canadians safe. Avant d'aller plus loin, je veux prendre un moment pour reconnaître les pertes incroyables auxquelles les gens ici en Nouvelle-Écosse et dans tout le Canada Atlantique et de l'Est du Québec ont été confrontés au cours des dernières semaines à la suite de la dévastation de l'ouragan Fiona, comme j'avais déjà mentionné. I know that there will continue to be a lot of work that is being done at the federal level by my colleagues, Ministers Blair and others, to assist with the recovery coming out of Fiona. As you heard Minister Lametti say, we had a very productive federal, provincial, territorial, ministerial here in Halifax over the last number of days. We just concluded a very productive set of discussions. Je tiens aussi à souligner que nous avons eu l'occasion de rencontrer les dirigeants autochtones nationaux, comme David a mentionné, afin de nous assurer que nos actions soient fondées sur leurs priorités et leurs perspectives. The meetings this week were held in the shadow of the tragedy at James Smith Cree Nation, and ministers were united in expressing our deep sorrow and sympathy for the members of the community there who've been dealing with this unspeakable grief over the past number of weeks. This is a heartbreaking reminder of the work that we must do together. And as I've said to my colleague, Minister Tell from Saskatchewan, I plan to be traveling to that community next week so that we can continue to collaborate across all levels of government with Indigenous communities and leadership to take the steps that are necessary so that this kind of tragedy never happens again, which of course relates to the work that we are doing together on First Nations policing. Policing by Indigenous peoples for Indigenous peoples is a key part of reconciliation, and I have shared a number of initiatives that we are advancing at the federal level. Our goal is straightforward: ensuring that Indigenous communities can keep everyone safe. Over the past number of months, I've been engaging with First Nations leaders and communities from Six Nations to Wendake to the Siksika Nation. Et c'est de toute évidence que nous avons entendu haut et fort que nous devons reconnaître les services de la police de Premières Nations comme un service essentiel. Nous avons entendu parler du besoin urgent d'un financement adéquat, stable, prévisible, équitable, flexible et adapté. This week, ministers discussed the progress we've made with leaders from the AFN and other title holders and rights holders, and recommitted ourselves to the important work that remains in front of us. We're committed to a two-track process, advancing the co-development of legislation that recognizes First Nations policing as an essential service and working with individual communities to establish new police forces along with the national Indigenous organizations like AFN, ITK, and the Métis National Council. Just last month, we announced the creation of a new self-directed force for the Siksika Nation, which is the first such new announcement for a First Nations police service in 14 years, showing that even as we advance First Nations Indigenous policing, as we advance the co-development of legislation which would recognize Indigenous policing as an essential service, we are making concrete progress in communities themselves, and that is something that we are committed to continuing. Secondly, I updated colleagues on our efforts to protect Canadians from the scourge of gun violence, which impacts communities large and small, far and wide. And as I broach this difficult subject matter, I want to take a moment to express our profound condolences to the families of the 2 police officers who lost their lives in South Simcoe in the Innisfil area in Ontario. We owe it to Constables Devon Northrup and Morgan Russell, and indeed all of the victims of gun violence, to take decisive action now and move swiftly to eradicate gun violence once and for all. As I've said many times before, there is no one single solution to this challenge. We're taking an all of the above approach with 3 key pillars. First, we want to advance smart and common sense laws. And the centerpiece of this pillar is Bill C-21, the most significant action on gun violence in Canada in a generation, which will implement a national freeze on handguns, address the role of guns in domestic and gender-based violence, and take aim at organized crime. It also includes our ban on assault-style weapons like AR-15s and a buyback program to get these weapons of war off of our streets once and for all. Le deuxième pilier consiste des mesures à nos frontières et de l'appui aux forces de l'ordre pour lutter contre le contrebande d'armes à feu. Nous avons fait des investissements majeurs dans la SFC, la GRC, ainsi que dans plusieurs programmes, et cela fonctionne. L'année dernière a été une année record pour les saisies à la frontière et nous continuerons à donner aux forces de l'ordre les outils dont elles ont besoin pour lutter contre le trafic d'armes. Le troisième pilier, c'est d'investir dans nos communautés, à soutenir la prévention pour arrêter la violence armée avant qu'elle ne commence. Le Fonds pour des communautés plus sûres, doté de 250 millions de dollars, en est le fer de lance. Il aidera nos jeunes à faire de bons choix et se préparer à réussir dans la vie. I know that all of my provincial and territorial colleagues share the objective of protecting communities from gun violence, and I look forward to continuing to collaborate with them as we have been doing. We're always welcoming a thoughtful discussion on the best way to move forward, but I've made clear to my colleagues and I agree that we must act, and the status quo is not an option. We must pull together and be bold in our efforts to protect our country from gun violence. And given that gun control will continue to be something that is part of our overall strategy, I know that there will be many more constructive discussions on this subject matter. Nous avons également discuté de notre travail collectif sur des questions telles que la criminalité rurale, la traite des êtres humains et la réduction de la récidive. Mon collègue, le ministre Lametti, a également dirigé ou co-dirigé des discussions sur d'importantes questions de justice. Gatherings like this are crucial to make the progress that we all want to make when it comes to keeping Canadians safe. The work of protecting our communities is a shared one because crime and violence don't recognize jurisdictional boundaries. We must speak with one voice and move forward with resolve. Thank you, merci. And now I will turn it over to our co-chair and our friend, Brad Johns. Minister.
Thank you very much, Minister. And I would also like to echo what was said before and send Nova Scotia's sympathies both to Saskatchewan in regards to those tragic events in September, and of course, most recently to Ontario on the events that occurred this week. Nova Scotians by far are well aware the impacts that gun violence and violence in our communities have on our province and on our communities, and we certainly send our sympathies. Good afternoon, and thank you for being here. This, of course, being our first in-person meeting of the federal, provincial, territorial justice ministers since 2019, and Nova Scotia has been very proud to hold the meetings here. These meetings are valuable. They're challenging times, and for the justice system here in Nova Scotia and right across the country. We are living in a time of complex social issues that can often manifest themselves in the lives of people who interact with the justice system. Rapid changing technology and cybercrime, protecting vulnerable populations, and treating them fairly gun violence, and keeping our courts running effectively are all possible challenges that we all face and require solutions. It's important that as Attorney Generals, Solicitor Generals, Justice and public safety ministers, that we get together to talk, to find common ground, share ideas, and address many of the critical challenges that are facing Canadians. I think I speak with all of my provincial and territorial counterparts who were in attendance over the last few days to say that I think our discussions were productive. And I know that we all look forward to working together with colleagues to continue to improve the justice system to keep all Canadians safe. Thank you. And with that, I believe we'll turn things back over to Minister Lametti for any questions, and I'll be around if there's any provincial questions.
Great, thank you, Minister Johns. Maintenant, nous passons à la période de questions. For those of you in the room, please queue up at the microphone opposite me if you wish to ask a question. In order for everyone to have an opportunity to participate, please limit yourself to one question and one follow-up. Please begin your question by identifying yourself and your outlet. And of course, participants who are on the teleconference call, you will also have an opportunity to ask questions. Let's start in the room. Microphone one, please.
Hi, it's Keith Doucette from Canadian Press. Obviously, we're in Nova Scotia, where we just wrapped up the public portion of the mass shooting inquiry. And the RCMP has been a topic of top of mind here and elsewhere in the country. So from coast to coast, communities across the country are either replacing the RCMP with local police forces or considering doing so. The RCMP have been accused of being slow to target gang violence in British Columbia, and they're not having enough officers to properly police Nova Scotia. What is it going to take for Ottawa to realize there was a problem in the RCMP's policing model?
Well, I appreciate the question. And anytime we talk about the Mass Casualty Commission, my thoughts immediately turn to the families, some of whom I've met with. And I know that this continues to be a period of great difficulty and anguish and loss for them, which is why the Commission's work is so important. And I think it's also important to add that we embrace the work of the Commission. We look forward to the recommendations that they will make around the relationship between the RCMP and Nova Scotia here. And indeed, this was the subject matter of our discussion between the federal government and provincial territorial governments. It is in my mandate to have a broad-ranging discussion around the contractual relationship between the RCMP and various provincial and territorial jurisdictions. We know that there are challenges. There are challenges around resourcing. There are challenges around making sure that we're able to recruit incoming members. There are challenges around addressing some of the systemic barriers that relate to Indigenous peoples. And I do want to signal that this is precisely why I issued an updated mandate letter to the Commissioner of the RCMP, Brenda Luckie, to ensure that there is an appropriate focus, not only to find a way to reduce those barriers, to make sure that Canadians are getting access to a level of policing that is at a standard of excellence that they are entitled to get, but equally to make sure that we are embarked on a process of modernizing our relationships so that it works for provinces and territories. And as I indicated to my colleagues, my door will always be open to have that conversation as we go forward.
And as a follow-up, what concretely do you think needs to change at the RCMP in order to rebuild Canadians' confidence in the federal police force? As we heard here, confidence was severely shaken.
Well, and I accept that. And I know that the Commissioner does as well. And that's why making sure that we are very much united in doing the work at both addressing challenges around having sufficient resources on the ground, making sure that there is appropriate training that is put into place. Making sure, as we saw in James Smith Cree Nation, that there is an appropriate level of communication and information that is being disseminated to the public when there is an urgent public order event that is occurring, leveraging all of the technology that is available, using social media, using alerts, using other channels so that Canadians can remain alert is certainly one of the lessons that I'm sure that was taken out of Portapic, which again led to very devastating consequences. So I think that there is a real commitment within the RCMP to advance those reforms. And I know that there's a commitment across the country between the federal government and our provincial and territorial partners to, again, modernize the relationship in a way that works for all.
Do you think that it needs to change the actual relationship the RCMP has with, say, local police forces in various provinces, that kind of thing?
I think unequivocally there is a need to implement ongoing reforms, which is why we issued the mandate letter to the commissioner of the RCMP. And I know that that is something that she and the entire RCMP are committed to implementing. And it's a discussion that we're continuing to have at the provincial and territorial level as well. Thank you.
Next question, please.
John McPhee from the Chronicle Herald. So when you talk about the contractual relationship between the RCMP and the provincial level, are you talking about those kind of changes, those kind of reforms that need to be put in place in order to better handle something like a mass casualty incident? Is that what we're talking about?
Well, the contractual service arrangements that we have reached with provincial and territorial governments are there in service of protecting Canadians and by extension, making sure that provinces and territories with whom we share the day-to-day administration of justice and policing priorities are properly supported. And in a number of jurisdictions, including here in Nova Scotia, that means having a direct relationship with the RCMP. Of course, as we modernize, as we look at the nature of that relationship, we are taking into account some of the challenges, including the mass casualties that have occurred in Nova Scotia, more recently in Saskatchewan. And that's why I feel as though I've certainly profited from the input and the advice that we are getting from our provincial and territorial partners on how we can address resourcing challenges, how we can continue to not only recruit, but retain individuals who want to step forward and serve their communities in a Mountie uniform. And so that will be part of the discussion, even as we tackle some of the other long-term systemic challenges that we have seen, not only within the RCMP, but broadly across law enforcement, so that Canadians feel safe. And I know that that is something that we're all committed to doing coming out of these meetings.
Thank you. Regarding the concept of a First Nations policing program, what could that possibly look like? I realize that you're early on in the discussions of this, but would we be talking about something similar to the RCMP in terms of a national force that would have local? What are you talking about there?
Well, I think at its core, it's about creating relationships that are rooted in respect and trust and a recognition that Indigenous communities and right across the country, the Inuit communities in the north, have the right to self-determine their charted course, their path when it comes to public safety matters, as it does in all matters. And therefore, we have to begin there. But in the meantime, we want to accelerate the rollout of historic federal funding under the First Nations Indigenous Policing Program. That's something that I look forward to doing in partnership with our provincial and territorial partners. It also means that we have to eventually transition away from a programs-based approach under the FNIPP to something that is longer-term, structural, and sustainable. And that's why we've committed to co-developing with Indigenous and Inuit communities across the country legislation that recognizes that Indigenous policing is an essential service. And the manifestation of that framework is obviously going to be done in close consultation with provincial and territorial partners, but it looks like what we accomplished with Siksika, where again, communities who are ready to take the step of creating their own police service and have a plan should be met with a partner in the federal government. And that's our commitment. We were able to do it there. We hope to be able to do it elsewhere.
Is there a time frame for this to complete this kind of program?
Well, the work is ongoing. It's ongoing under the First Nations Indigenous Policing Program, and it's also ongoing in terms of the co-development of the legislation. And I know I've gotten questions about when will that legislation make the floor of the House of Commons. I would like to see that done as soon as possible, but we also want to be respectful of consulting Indigenous communities right across the country, which is precisely what we're doing.
Thank you. Now we'll open the phone line to questions. Operator, please proceed.
Thank you. Merci. Please press star one at this time if you have a question. S'il vous plaît, appuyez sur étoile 1 maintenant pour poser une question. The first question is from Dylan Robertson, the Canadian Press. Please go ahead. Mr. Robertson?
Hi, sorry about that. Thanks for taking our questions today. A question for Minister Mendicino about the Iran sanctions. Just hoping that you could clarify the timeline for these new measures. You mentioned yesterday that this would be in place within weeks, but does that include the hiring of the specialists, or is that more a matter of months or years? Could you just walk me through the timeline for the various pieces of the Iranian sanctions package?
Well, to recap, we've introduced a new set of comprehensive measures, including a sparingly used but powerful provision under the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act that will designate the not only the IRGC, but the entirety of the Iranian regime as a purveyor of transgressions against human rights, as well as facilitating acts of terror. And, you know, based on the very public record that we know about the Iranian regime and all that supported, that is something that is occurring with great dispatch and work that is being undertaken by the Canada Border Services Agency even now. With regards to how we're going to implement the sanctions that flow from that designation, including rendering people inadmissible who work in the most responsible and culpable roles of the Iranian regime, including the ability to seize and freeze assets which could be used to advance their interests. We invested $76 million. And that $76 million is going to be partitioned across a number of line agencies, including the RCMP, who will stand up a unit to do that work. As I said yesterday, we're moving forward as urgently as we possibly can. And we want to make sure that we get, you know, those boots on the ground as quickly as possible.
With respect, Minister, like you said all of that yesterday. My question is if you'd like to clarify the timing, because you know, I have people in the government saying that what you said yesterday, this is coming within weeks, that's not the full story. I'm giving you an opportunity here to clarify. Is this all coming within weeks, or is this coming within months? Could you please clarify the timeline for hiring up these people?
Well, in answer to your question, the time frame of referring to weeks is about making sure that we can move forward with that designation of the Iranian regime, which is work that the CBSA is doing right now. And with regards to implementing the sanctions, I want to make it clear to you, Dylan, and to your readers and to everyone that work is ongoing. It's not as though we are just standing up resources now to make good on the sanctions that we have imposed against the Iranian regime. We've been doing that all along. What we are talking about now is adding additional resources through the $76 million allocation that we announced just a few days ago, in addition to existing resources within our public safety and national security community to ensure that we are in a position to implement. So this is not about starting from square one. This is about building on top of an already robust public safety and national security apparatus that has the ability to implement and enforce sanctions. And this additional capacity will just further strengthen our ability to do just that, to hold those who are responsible for violating human rights, who are responsible for the downing of PS 752, who are responsible for Mahsa Amini, who are responsible for the ongoing torture and killings of those women and young girls who are protesting in Iran for their rights, so that we can bring all of those individuals to justice. And that is exactly what we're going to do.
Thank you. Merci. Once again, please press star 1 if you have questions. De nouveau, n'hésitez pas à appuyer sur étoile 1 pour toute question.
All right, thank you, operator.
Thank you very much.
That concludes today's events. If you have any additional questions, please email Public Safety Media Relations at media@ps-sp.gc.ca. Merci beaucoup.